It is Phumlani Majosi, the author of Lessons from Past Heroes. This is the Phumlani Majosi Show. I'm talking to you from London, Great Britain. This week I've been here since last week. I first attended the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, ARC Forum. What an experience. I met amazing people, so amazing speeches. From Douglas Murray to Dr. Jordan Peterson to Sir Neil Ferguson to John Anderson. You could go on. Ayan Ixi Ali, remarkable speakers we saw in person last week with a beautiful message of free markets, personal responsibility, family, hard work, on energy policies, the very much good push for fossil fuels, coal. These are things that we should use to power our economies in the developing world. Really was an experience. And my guest and I, Gabriel Makin, are going to touch on that later. Gabriel, how are you, sir? Wonderful to see you. And you look younger and younger.
Thank you so much for having me on, Phumlani. It was great to see you too.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. No, it's great to see you, man, here in London. Gabriel, so let's just jump straight into it. The recent Social Research Foundation poll, it's very interesting because it shows the ANC declining from 40% last year in May to 32%. And I believe this poll you conducted it this month. Tell us more about this because I see the DA in your poll seems to have gained from 22% last time in May in terms of support to 25, and then others, the MK party, the EFF, IFP as well, declining there. What's going on there? Tell us about that, about your recent poll, your latest poll.
Yes, so the important figures before we talk about the poll itself is to make sure that your viewers are aware of the sample size and the margin of error. So we had about a sample size of 1,004 people, which puts us at a margin of error of 4%. So whenever I say a number, what that means is that that number could vary 4% up or 4% down. Um, and so that's the important information that we need to know before we discuss the polling. And then you mentioned the top line figures, and were incredibly surprising, somewhat exciting. But yes, the ANC in our latest poll conducted from the 3rd to the 17th of February is at 32%. The DA sits at 25%, MK sits at 12, EFF at 6, and the IFP at 3, and then every other party is well within the margin of error. So it's not worth us really discussing and mentioning their numbers because they could really be anywhere. And so one of the questions that kind of emerges is, well, if your viewers are paying attention, they might realize that the numbers don't add up to 100%. And the reason why is that we now have 15% of the electorate who are undecided. And that doesn't just mean that they responded, I don't know, to the question, if there was an election held today, who would you vote for? Because that's not just how we figure out who these people are going to vote for. We use various models that come out of our survey to figure out who will vote for which party. These models include using party favorability and leadership favorability to assign voters to parties based on how warmly they feel towards them or how warm they feel towards their leaders. And what's interesting is that with 15% undecided, it means that those 15% they don't know who they would vote for when they ask that question directly, but they also don't feel warmly towards any of the big parties or leaders in the country. And so that means that they are truly undecided. But the question then becomes, well, you can't actually have an election result where 15% of people write, I don't know on the ballot. It's simply not an option. So the responsible thing to do here is to figure out, okay, well, you know, it seems as though that the ANC is the only one who's lost a significant chunk from where they were, as you mentioned, in May to where they are now. And so if there were an actual election held today, it's unlikely that the ANC would actually get 32% because those 15% of undecided voters would have to land somewhere. And the likelihood is most of them would land in the ANC because it seems that most of them have left the ANC. But crucially, so the ANC sits around 40%, but crucially, that's not what the situation is right now. We're in 2025. We don't have an election this year. And so people can actually afford to be undecided, to be waiting and seeing how politics will develop. And so those 15% are going to probably decide the balance of power in South Africa moving forward.
Very, very interesting. 15% undecided. And we are saying that the NC would likely, if the election was held tomorrow, or maybe in 2 months, which means that the NC would get some time to campaign, right? To go out
Yes.
and encourage people to vote for its policies. Um, Now, I mean, it's interesting that I look at what's going on with the EFF. Tell me about that. EFF seems to have had issues over the past months. There seems to be some leadership issues. Mbuyiseni Ndlozi is gone. You have this gentleman from Limpopo as well, Limpopo. Who is him? Who is he? Floyd Shivambu went to the MK party. Tell me about the EFF a bit. Where are we with the EFF? Because they don't seem to have done well in the last election last year in comparison to the previous one. And now in this poll, they seem to be showing that decline. Is there anything to should the EFF supporters be concerned about the fate of their party in your analysis?
EFF supporters should definitely be very concerned about the state of their party. One of the interesting things that kind of developed with the May 2024 elections is that with the introduction of Jacob Zuma's MK party, which ran on a policy platform very similar to that of the EFF, there's now a split in options on the more radical populist left. And so voters now have to kind of do a toss up between who they like more, Julius Malema or Jacob Zuma. And that's a very hard decision to make. But one of the interesting things that I've always kind of known about the EFF, because we've been polling their supporters for years now, is that the EFF support base doesn't really buy into the policy agenda of the EFF. You see, I think it was put to me by a colleague of mine, someone that you know very well, Dr. Franz Cranier, and he said, in his opinion, the Red Beret is probably the single greatest marketing campaign that has ever happened in South Africa. Because when you put that Red Beret on, you become a part of something bigger. And so it hasn't been this for some of the EFF supporters, I'm sure it is the case that the radical populist policies are what drives them towards that party. But according to our data, and let me flesh this out a little bit, so
Yeah.
when we asked people things like support for BEE policies, what ends up very interestingly happening is that EFF support splits round about the same as DA support, where a vast majority of EFF supporters are against BEE policies for government appointments, for procurement. When we ask things like should we lower taxes and create a more business-friendly environment, or should the government raise more taxes to allow for them to provide services better? Again, the EFF voters will split very similarly to DA voters, where they say we want less taxes and a more business-friendly environment. And that makes no sense if you think that this EFF support just comes from the policy platform of the party. But it's obvious it's not coming from the policy platform of the party. And so what I think is interesting, what you point out about this, the kind of internal divisions, the strife within the party, the back and forth between MK, is that sense of belonging, that sense of this powerful movement that's moving forward was a thing that was drawing people in. They could put on that red beret and they're something part of something bigger. But now when you put on that red beret, you're part of something that is bleeding support. You are part of an internal, and all of those issues mean that the supporters who really weren't there for the policies being offered were there because they liked the leadership, they enjoyed being they enjoyed being part of a greater movement, feel as though this movement is flagging. And if I'm not part of this great big movement, then what am I doing? Because I don't really support, I don't want to nationalize things. I maybe don't even want to I don't hold terribly divisive views against white people in South Africa, for example. And so it's a very worrying position if I was an EFF supporter. And the problem is though, and why I've mentioned MK as well, is that MK supporters going to struggle from the same problem because MK supporters as well are moderate, pragmatic voters. And they also align on almost every single question, except for the question of should we ally with the West or Russia and China, the MK supporters look like a more conservative DA voter. And so the parties aren't generating their support via their policy platforms. And so just by hammering on different policy areas, they aren't going to generate more people towards them. What they what they're generating their support is the sense of belonging and the sense of the kind of the fact that you feel connected to the leadership of both of those parties. And with the internal divisions in both parties starting to show through more and more, it will drive supporters away because it's those people, those interpersonal relationships at the top that were driving them towards the parties, and the fracturing will drive them away from the party.
No, that's a very interesting point because it's what I was thinking about. I've been thinking about lately. Because I mean, let's just put politics a bit aside, right? Because right now we're just talking about the EFF and the MK party, but even the general surveys, Gabriel, some of them having been done by the RR, the Institute of Race Relations. South Africans, they are not pro race-based policies, right? Now, forget about, let's just put those surveys aside, which are more sort of academic and intellectual. And I've looked at interviews done by ENCA. Now, this is more anecdotal because it's not really a bulk of evidence or research. I've done, because I watch the ENCA news channel. I've looked at their interviews with people over the past year as we were marking 30 years of our democracy with the election and all of that, when they asked people, should we have race-based policies 30 years into our democracy? Guess what, Gabriel? People would say no, right? These are black people on the streets, right? You go to KwaZulu Natal, where I come from. They did some sort of a drive, their election drive, ANCA, and asked people what really matters to them, and there was no this thing of the obsession of a land reform, the idea that we need race-based policies, the concerns that you've got the white minority that still controls the economy. So I mean, voters in South Africa, they tend to be very much by action, practical people, right?
Mm.
And how they think about issues. It's only when it comes to voting, when then those persons they start voting for, I mean, the leaders, as you said, they affiliate with, or someone they relate to, could be the EFF, the MK party, and so on. So it's quite an interesting situation that is taking place then. And then let's talk about the DA now briefly, right? Gabriel, look, I just feel, and I had a discussion with Martin van Staden 2 weeks back about this. I interviewed him here on this show.
Mm.
My concern, Gabriel, is that the DA looks very weak in this new, right? I just think they are very weak. They are underestimating themselves. They have let the ANC go through with the stuff that the ANC should have never went through with. I'm just glad now they are pushing back on the budget, which is why it was postponed, and sort of proposing their alternative sort of points as to how the budget should look like. And I commend them for this. But they've been weak over the past 6 months of this government of national unity. Um, what is your sense? I see in your poll that they seem to have increased their support from 2022 to 25. What's going on in the DA and how do you see them? Are they being effective in this GNU in terms of defending and pushing for classical liberal values? What's going on there?
So I think the point you raised that you and Martin van Staden talked about, that the DA is essentially being bullied and by the
Yeah,
ANC,
yeah.
and the ANC is control of the agenda of the GNU is actually working in the DA's favor in a very weird way. And you'll need to indulge me to explain why I think this is.
Yeah.
So the first SRF poll that was ever done was done in 2022. It was a massive sample size, over 3,200 voters, geographically, demographically representative, with a margin of error of 2%. So it's probably a good way of thinking about it is that the numbers are doubly as accurate almost than the poll that we've done now. And that poll, we wanted to create a kind of we wanted to see exactly what the market of public opinion in South Africa looked like. And one of the most crucial findings from that poll was we did this word association game where we gave voters a word or a phrase such as has good leadership, has good policies, provides accountability, only cares about themselves, makes broken promises, etc., etc., etc. And we said, which party do you think that these words describe the most? And so when it came to the ANC, the words that describe the ANC the best, according to voters, was makes broken promises, only cares about themselves, and anti-poor. When it came, just as an aside, your viewers, I'm sure, will find this amusing. When it came to the EFF, the associations were violent and racist. Um, and then we come to the DA, and the DA while close with the ANC in terms of these views, were viewed by a plurality of voters as having good leadership, having good policies, and providing accountable governance. So way, way back in 2022, what the Social Research Foundation discovered was that voters in South Africa did not associate the ANC brand with competence. And that's crucial for where we are now, because cut forward to the 2024 elections, there's the disastrous results for the ANC. They lose 17% of the vote. And all of a sudden, they have to form a government of national unity with opposition parties who previously they'd been deriding, they'd been calling racist, they'd said that they would never work with in many ways, and yet they happily formed a government with them. Then we see as the GNU develops that the ANC start to take more and more control over the policy agenda of the government. But the voters never gave an indication that the ANC's policy agenda is what they wanted. In fact, in all of the polling we'd done, we'd found that the ANC's policy agenda was incredibly unpopular. And so what happens when the ANC joins the GNU is they give everyone a false time horizon, which is we're coming together with these centrist parties and we're going to work on the reforms to make this country great. We're coming together to work together. And then that doesn't happen. They go back to governing in the same way they had been governing previously, just now with the DA as kind of rubber stamp people, yes men. But the thing is, voters hadn't wanted that. The voters had wanted the government to come together and to actually pursue real reforms in the economy, particularly because the number one issue that's every time we do the polling, jobs and unemployment, and should have been the main focus of the government from day one if they wanted to bring voters on their side. But they didn't do that. And so everyone has seen that the ANC is dominating the agenda, but the ANC is not viewed as competent, and the ANC's agenda is not widely liked. And so move forward to now, and voters are like, well, this is not what we wanted. We wanted the parties to come together and work together. And maybe the DA is not being forceful enough. It's not pursuing its own agenda. It's not trying to make the ANC reform quick enough. But voters aren't angry at the DA for that because they feel as though, well, they understand that really it's the ANC, they're the biggest party, they need to be the ones setting the way forward. And the fact that the ANC have set a way forward that goes back to the unpopular agenda of the past means that the DA, just by doing nothing, grows because the DA is still seen as competent and capable, whereas the ANC's agenda is driving people away and making the government essentially the governing party is essentially an extension of the ANC, which no one wanted.
So now, okay, so this is very interesting. Um, because what is happening now, Gabriel, is that um, I mean, I was in another sort of discussion not long time ago. I was asked as to have are we seeing any changes, right? Is there any change in policy, in the direction of policy since May last year, right? Okay, let's say since the coalition government was formed. And my view is that not there hasn't been really. I was expecting the country to move to the center, not to the right. The country is not going to move to the right in South Africa, but at least to be pushed a bit to the center on very much critical matters, right? You could be talking about Bella, you could be talking about expropriation, you could be talking about the NHI is coming now. They seem to be having some serious discussions there. It may be in some right direction. I'm not sure. Um, but that sort of movement to the center, and I'm not seeing that. You look at Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address, the ambitions and the goal, you realize that there's no real movement here to the center on key critical issues, including, of course, BE and so on, at least to sort of slow down on race-based policies. So I'm not. It doesn't seem to me that things have changed at all. Rather, the NC continues with its agenda. And your argument is that, given that the voters they still detach the DA, right? They are removing the DA from that. They don't see it as they don't blame it. They don't see it as complicit. They are still, or at least the observation is that, well, it's ANC, really. It isn't the DA. That's what we are saying, right? That they can still separate the two in the
Exactly.
coalition government.
And we asked a direct question on this in our latest poll. We asked, I'm going to read you three statements. Can you tell me which one you agree with most? Three statements were the ANC controls everything in the GNU, the GNU is an equal partnership, or the small parties control everything in the GNU. And 50% of all voters agree with the first statement that the ANC controls everything. But then when you break it down, all vast majorities of opposition voters, so about 62% of DA voters, 70% of FF plus voters, et cetera, think that the ANC controls everything. And so there is the correct perception that it is really the ANC in charge of the policy agenda. And then a last point, it's not just the race-based policies that voters don't like. It's
Yeah,
all of the populist
yeah,
policies.
yes.
Because
True. Yeah.
we asked three questions about expropriation in this latest poll. We asked, do you think it's a good economic idea? 66%, two-thirds of voters said no. Do you think that it will drive investors out of the country? 66% of voters, two-thirds, said yes, it will drive investors out of the country. And then the last question, do you trust the government to expropriate land in the public interest? And then two-thirds of voters again said no. And so it's every single populist policy, the NHI, Bella, expropriation, they all are viewed by the voters as populist and not as policies that are going to improve their living standards. And that's what they want. That's the simplest thing, is that voters simply want their lives to improve through government policy, and they understand that the populist agenda of the ANC will not achieve that for them.
I'm speaking to Gabriel Makin. He's a researcher at the Social Research Foundation. We are just talking about various issues. The recent polls on South Africa's political parties and their support. We are going to talk now about the ARC conference he and I attended here in London last week and touch on and close off on British politics. Remember to get yourself a copy of my book at a bookstore near you. I've been having a great time in Britain. I love Britain because when I'm here, I was here last December. My books were, I was signing copies for people. And then I came back here, all the books I brought with me. I no longer have them. Great. I've been signing copies. So it's awesome. So do get yourself a copy of my book, Lessons from Past Heroes, at a bookstore near you, or you can order on Amazon.co.za or take a lot. And I'm wearing my Adam Smith tie. Gabriel, remember where I bought this tie? Do you remember that?
Yeah, yes,
At
I
the
do.
ARC
I
conference
do.
last week. Tell me about that. What was your experience of the ARC conference? It was your
So
first time. It was my second time. I attended the inaugural one in 2023 November. Yeah. So this was second. But how did you find it yourself? What was the experience?
I found it phenomenally fascinating. I mean, you mentioned some of the brilliant speakers that we had presenting. And what I did find all the more kind of inspiring and fascinating was to see there were about 4,200, over 4,200 delegates there. And every conversation you would strike up with someone, the what the conversations would always revolve around is what can we build to make things better? Because we're tired of this like empty criticism. Everything's bad. Everything's bad. The left has moved too far. The left has moved too far. It's like, no, what the thing is that we're doing now is we're finding an alternative. We're putting a positive vision forward that we're going to say, no, yes, we are tired of what the left has done and the move towards the more radical populist left on a global scale. But what we are trying to do is recapture a positive vision of the center and center right, marrying the kind of classic liberal and conservatives together to generate something better to offer than just the criticism. And I found that extraordinarily inspiring, especially given the wide variety of people that were attending the conference.
Yeah, yeah. I think, the ARC has been, some people have said it's an alternative to the World Economic Forum. And some people, even some of the speakers, did say something along those lines. How important is this global movement, this ARC movement that holds different views from those of the World Economic Forum in terms of energy policies, in terms of economic policies? How important is this
I think
movement?
I think it's incredibly important because one of the things that I think has happened in politics generally since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the kind of beginning of the end of history era, so to speak, and luckily I think we're at the end of this end of history era. But the end of history delusion made people think that really there's no more competition between states, and now what we can do in the West is everyone can just be nice. And if we're just nice, that will solve everything. But
Mm,
reality the reality is that China and Russia never bought into this end of history delusion. And the West has, through this kind of delusion, allowed the kind of activist voices inside of it to become so fiercely critical, so set against the foundations that made the Western societies brilliant to begin with. Free markets, freedom of speech, all of the kind of liberties that one associates with liberal democracy. And what ARC is trying to do is to say, no, the things that made us great can make us great once again. And it's not empty populism. It's not sloganeering. It is the fact that free markets generate the wealth that have allowed hundreds of millions of people in the last 20 years to pull themselves out of poverty. It is a fact that the Western societies, based on the central freedoms of the individual, have much better outcomes than other countries who do not have these freedoms. And so the ARC conference, by bringing together people from around the world who share these values, allows people to know that they have allies across the world and that there are people who are working day and night to bring the foundations back and to make people realize how important it is, and so that we don't lose those foundations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And who do you think who were your favorite speakers? I know you told me you had an encounter with Dr. Jordan Peterson. How was the experience having a sort of a dialogue with him?
So I did have a wonderful meeting with Jordan Peterson. He's a personal hero of mine. If I were to write my lessons from past heroes, he'd be the one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, that was phenomenally interesting. I just wanted to say to him, thank you for kind of all the influence he's had in my life. And it was phenomenal in that just kind of 3, 4 minutes interaction. He didn't break eye contact with me. And he said to me, when I told him I'm involved in South African politics, I work for a think tank, he said, well, very good luck to you then, and you will need it, but I believe in you. And so that just hearing that from someone that has been so influential in my life was an inspiring thing. But then on the question of who of my favorite speakers, well, I'd certainly recommend that all your viewers check out Bjorn Lomborg's speech. I think that he is one of the best people in describing why the green energy policies are doing massive economic damage and why we need to walk back from them and kind of figure out how to have a climate policy that isn't economically disruptive. Then I thought that although he was a controversial speaker uh, in at the time, I thought David Brooks has a phenomenally interesting speech because it's just a way of kind of thinking about the Trump movement and conservatism in America, and kind of reveals some of the internal divisions amongst the conservatives and the Trump movement. And then the last one, I think his name was Arthur Brooks. We had two Brooks. He was a person who studies the science of happiness,
Yes,
and
that
he
that
took
guy, the professor at Harvard. I liked Arthur Brooks as well. Yeah. Hmm.
exactly. He was. I thought the kind of he gives a very good guide, and simple things that you can do to maximize the happiness, not the kind of happy haha feelings, but the kind of drive, motivation, the meaning in your life that keeps you going. There's the simple things and what you need to focus on to live a kind of quote unquote happy life. So those were definitely my top three speakers, and I would recommend all your viewers check them out.
Yeah, yeah. I liked, yeah, as I've just said, I liked Arthur Brooks on the science of happiness, Douglas Murray, very much powerful as well. Um, yeah, Bjorn is something else, man, especially for developing countries when it comes to
Yes.
an understanding, energy policy. So Bjorn Lomborg I've known him for a while now. He's a great economist. Um, Professor Neil Ferguson, very much spot on the problems of debt and how that can be destructive. Vivek Ramaswamy, I loved him as well. He spoke via video. On the point of the fact that things like public debt or government debt, they're not just an economic issue, Gabriel. They're also a moral issue, right? Should we allow to the accumulation of debt, in a way that doesn't stop? And should we really? Is it really moral to say that debt that we are accumulating will have to be paid by future generations? So I thought, I mean, all the speakers were just great. I came out inspired by the event, and I hope that you and I now will take the lessons and go back and sort of spread the message in South Africa. But here's the thing, you are here in London now, so we have 3 minutes. You are based here. What do you see in politics? Are you positive about the UK, or are you negative about the UK? Are you positive or negative?
In
Optimistic
a
or pessimistic?
in a very brief time we have left, I have to say, living here now, I'm much more optimistic about the future of South Africa than I am about the future of the United Kingdom. And I know that sounds counterintuitive given the scale and the immensity of the problems in South Africa. And I'm sure your viewers are well aware in your analysis all of the different problems. But the thing that South Africa has that the UK doesn't, because is the UK feels like a very stagnant nation that it was once great and they've forgotten what made it great. And there's no one talking about, that no one taking pride in what they were and no one trying to move the country back to what they were. And it's such a tragedy because instead it feels as if, politics here is defined by kind of pessimism, a sense that there's nothing we can do, and it's a kind of sense of just managed decline. And that's tragic because, South Africa owes a lot of our liberal democratic traditions to this country. And to see it in such a sorry state does really break my heart. And so I would say, I'm a optimistic person, a realistically optimistic person generally, but the prospects are not good here. And I wish I had more time to elaborate, but I
You are
don't
saying
want
the
to see.
prospects are not good.
Not good.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
am not, we've got 4.5 more years of labor, and that's 4.5 more years of pain.
Gabriel Makin is a researcher at the Social Research Foundation. Thank you so much for a great conversation, sir. It really has been awesome. Remember to subscribe on my YouTube channel. We have just above 2,000 subscribers now. Help us go to 3,000, to 10,000, and to 1,000,000. It's Phumlani Majosi, the author of Lessons from Past Heroes. We'll chat soon.